This week, the U.S. Treasury extended a $20 billion swap line from the U.S. Treasury to the country of Argentina. And the big question is, was this a bailout of Argentina or was this a buyout of Argentina? And it's a big deal. And some people are very upset about it. Some people are very excited about it. But I think it's important to keep it in proper context when thinking about it. So that's what we're going to talk about today on Milkshakes, Markets, and Madness. You know, this is a show where we talk about the financial markets. We talk about the madness surrounding those financial markets. And we do it all through the lens of the dollar milkshake theory, which is really based on American hegemony. And there's really nothing more relevant than American hegemony when we talk about what's going on with Argentina right now. So let's just bring up some slides here. But essentially what happened was, you know, Argentina has had, you know, a reputation of financial mismanagement and problems for literally decades. And it has always been the country of the future. I can remember being in business school 25 years ago, and it was like the next great place. And it was just a matter of time until, you know, Argentina emerged from its slumber and problems, and it was going to be, you know, kind of this world beater place because it has such incredible resources and people and opportunities. But, you know, for the last 3 decades, you know, they've just had problem after problem. And a couple of years ago, we were there a couple of years ago on vacation, right before Milei was elected. And it was, listen, it's just a fantastic country. Anybody who has an opportunity to go down there, either for business or just for fun, I mean, it's incredible. I can't tell you how much fun we had down there. But essentially, Milei, who's kind of a populist president, came to power a couple of years ago, and he's instituted radical reforms. But the country has a lot of debt, and despite some of his reforms that he put in and some of the positive changes that have been made, they still had large payments that had to be made to the IMF and other creditors. And with some of the struggles that they're still having in their economy, they were running out of the dollars to do that. So, you know, this week the Treasury announced that they were going to extend a $20 billion swap line to Argentina. And, you know, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, indicated that they had outright purchased, you know, pesos on the market to keep the strength of the peso so that Argentina didn't have to do it themselves and waste their own precious dollar reserves to do it. But this is, again, just shows you how when you operate on the global stage, you still need dollars to operate. You know, if Argentina didn't need dollars, then this wouldn't be a problem, but it is a problem. And so essentially what I think is really interesting about it is that this wasn't a Fed swap line. This was a Treasury swap line, and it's done through the ESF, which is a Treasury facility rather than a Federal Reserve facility. I don't know if there was any discussion internally. I know the Bank of Argentina does not have a direct swap line with the Fed, but that doesn't mean one couldn't be set up. But my guess is that the Treasury just wanted to control this completely themselves, and that's why they didn't involve the Fed. But, you know, I think before we get into why and how and all that stuff, it's really important to understand the importance of Argentina. Because in my opinion, this has nothing to do with economics. Or, I mean, I shouldn't say that. It's not that it doesn't have anything to do with economics, but it's more about strategy. It's more about, you know, the U.S.'s role in the Western Hemisphere and in the world, and the play and the way that Argentina plays into that. I don't think that Scott Bessent went out and bought $20 billion, spent $20 billion or expended a $20 billion swap line because he thinks buying Argentinian pesos is this great financial idea. But essentially, Argentina is the 3rd largest economy in Latin America, you know, very heavily reliant on natural resources and agriculture. You know, its GDP is around 600 billion. But you know, it has a public debt to GDP of over 85%. And a large percent is denominated in foreign currencies. And again, if you owe debt in a currency that you can't print, and that exchange rate goes against you, it can be a real problem. This is how hyperinflation typically happens. You know, when you have your debt in a currency that you don't have control of, that is when you have to print a bunch of your currency to meet that debt, and that's how hyperinflation happens. But fiscal policy, has been a struggle. They faced large fiscal deficits, and then these loan conditions were coming due. And even though inflation had come down dramatically, and some of the reforms that Milei had put in place have helped the economy and have attracted foreign capital back to Argentina, it still was not enough to offset the problems. Especially what happened was in the kind of the mid equivalent of midterm elections in Argentina, Milei's party lost. Milei is still in power, but his party lost some ground, and so that led people to think that maybe his policies are no longer working or will no longer be implemented in the future, and that comes into question. And so then capital started to leave, and it causes all these problems. But from a strategic perspective, Argentina has a ton of energy. They have huge shale and gas reserves, one of the largest unconventional resources in the world. Again, they're an agricultural powerhouse, tons of grains and meats and agricultural exports. They have huge minerals, especially lithium, and lithium is extremely important for batteries and a lot of current technology. And they have, again, it's just a great country from natural resources, whether it's wind, solar, et cetera, et cetera. And not to mention fresh water, which I think could be a huge thing in the future. So again, it's just from a natural resource perspective, it's kind of a gold mine, no pun intended. And from a geographic perspective, it's incredibly important. It sits at the bottom of the Western Hemisphere. Any ship that goes around the bottom of South America has to go through Argentinian waters. It provides access not only to Antarctica, but both the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean through the Antarctic routes. And it's a very important trade corridor. And it's just from a strategic perspective, geographically, it's incredibly important. And then let's talk a little bit more about the bailout itself. So essentially, what they did is they created a swap line, which is a swap line is when Argentina pledges pesos and the United States gives them dollars in exchange, and at some point Argentina has to pay the dollars back. But in my opinion, these will probably never be paid back. And you can see that as a potentially bad deal, or you can see it as a potentially good deal. And I'll tell you why that is. But the idea is that it provides stability to Argentina's currency. It lets the rest of the world know that it's not just Argentina on their own. The full power of the U.S. Treasury is behind them, and that hopefully keeps capital in Argentina and potentially even attracts more capital to come to Argentina. Again, it was done through the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which is a Treasury function. It's not the traditional Fed swap line. But essentially, what it did is it halted the peso's free fall. It tightened bond spreads, and it eased the capital flight pressures. And this is important from a strategic perspective because it shows the United States' commitment to the Western Hemisphere. And we're going to get into that a little bit more in a little bit. But I mean, and Bessent even literally came out and said this, Argentina doing well and Argentina being a strategic ally of the United States is putting America first. It's a way to shore up the southern part of the hemisphere, make sure that is a U.S. ally and not an ally of the BRICS or an ally of China or whoever it is. And it also provides stability down there. The last thing the United States want is instability in South America when they are trying to kind of build fortress North America, South America, Western Hemisphere. And it helps them with supply chains. Again, the energy, control, even if the United States doesn't need the energy themselves, having the ability to potentially control the energy and also get access to any of those resources that the U.S. may need as they kind of reconfigure supply lines is extremely important. So that is the reason for it. Now, is this an economic rescue of Argentina? Is this a bailout or is this a buyout? Now, you guys know me. I'm cynical enough to say that, listen, I don't care what they call it. The United States just put them in first line of refusal for any of the resources, any business that gets done in Argentina. United States and United States companies are now going to be at the front of the line to be involved in any new resources or any new business that is done. And this is a way for the United States to, again, put its hegemony out there and its role in the world. And not only that, but it kicks China out of there. China was making inroads. China gave them a big loan a couple years ago. China was trying to put a large military installation in southern Argentina. They've been doing a lot of overfishing in Argentinian waters. And this is a way for Argentina to align with the United States. And it basically neuters, China's ability to develop, a base, for lack of a better word there. And then let's just think about it. How many times have you heard that the dollar isn't worth anything? The dollar's worthless and it's going to zero. Okay, well, if the dollar's worthless, then why not give 20 billion of them to another country so that you get first right of refusal on all of their assets? And if you guys think that I'm being totally hyperbolic, saying that the United States now has first line of refusal on all their assets, that's just not how the world works. The United States did not give $20 billion to Argentina out of the goodness of their hearts. If you believe that, you're welcome to that belief, but that is not the way this works. So the idea that there aren't any quid pro quo strings tied to this quote unquote bailout, I think is silly. And to think about it, $20 billion sounds like a huge number, and it is. And I'm not making light of it, but their mineral assets alone are probably worth 30, 40, 50 billion. Their energy assets are worth several hundred billion, if not $1 trillion. So if you think of it as a buyout rather than a bailout, and in fact, you're actually going to get access to these resources rather than just giving, the $20 billion away, the deal starts to look a lot better, not to mention the strategic interests that the United States gets as a result as well. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. Now, of course, there's other narratives out there too. Some people say this was just Besant bailing out one of his buddies who had run a big hedge fund and had huge exposure to Argentina. And listen, maybe that's part of it. I don't know whether that's part of it. It would not shock me to learn that is part of it. But listen, again, we don't have to like this stuff, and I'm not here to tell you what I think should happen or shouldn't happen. I'm just telling you what is happening. And I think as you manage your portfolio, it's best to understand how the world actually works as opposed to the way you would like it to work. And if this bailout helps some of Besant's friends, well, I'm not totally shocked that is the case. The other part of this that is kind of controversial is, with the trade war this year, China has stopped buying American soybeans and the grains the way they have in the past. And so some of the farmers are hurting as a result. And the farmers are saying, why are you giving 20 billion to Argentina when they're selling their soybeans to China, when China is not buying any of ours? Where's our money? Well, the next thing I'd say is, well, the farmers are probably going to get some billions as well. And listen, I'm very sympathetic to this point of view. In fact, and there's a legitimate point to be made here. I mean, my family owns farmland. My family raises soybeans back in Kansas. So this is not a totally foreign concept to me. I understand what's going on here. But I think you will see that going forward, that some funds will be made available to the American farmers. Let's see here. But, one of the things I wanted to say as we kind of go into the next section here is if you haven't read this book, this is a book that was put out, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago. I actually had the pleasure of interviewing the author maybe 5 or 6 years ago on Real Vision. And I can't sit here and say that everything that he says is absolutely 100% correct, but I don't think he's wrong. And I think behind the scenes, this is largely a good explanation of how the system actually works. And essentially what he would say is the way this works is the first thing you do is you go down to Argentina and you very nicely ask them to partner. And if they do, that's great. And if they initially say no, then you go back down with a bunch of money and you say, you know what? I understand the last meeting didn't go perfectly, but maybe the cash in this bag will help you understand why this is a good idea a little bit better. Now, maybe the cash doesn't actually come in a bag. Maybe it's, in the form of funding or an IMF bailout or a US swap line. And And that will typically do the job. And if that doesn't work, then he says, well, then the jackals go in. And the jackals, they're the black ops, or they're the, the agitators. They're the ones that kind of rough things up a little bit, and encourage through other means, let's say, things to get done. And if the jackals still don't work, then you send in the military. And listen, this is not necessarily the way we necessarily want the world to be, but this is the way the world is. And this is largely how the world has played out since World War II. China has tried to do the same thing in the last, call it 10 or 15 years, with the bridge and road, not to the same extent and not with the same success. But, this is not an unusual format of which global economics and geopolitics is played. So I think the idea that the United States, again, is providing a lifeline to Argentina out of the goodness of its heart, and there's no, very strong strings attached to this funding, I think would be extremely naive. So I think keep that in mind as you're trying to decide whether this is good or bad deal from the United States perspective. And the other thing I would say is we've talked about this many, many times. And even when it's not about China, it's still about China. I mean, one of the big reasons they're doing this bailout is they want to have the influence in Argentina rather than China. They want China's influence not only out of Argentina, but they want it out of the Western Hemisphere. And Argentina is as good a place to start as anywhere else. And the fact that the United States may be pulling back from the world to a certain extent and focusing on the Western Hemisphere, even though that is true, and I believe that is true, it is still about China. And this brings us into the next part of this. And Argentina plays a role in this as well. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more. But, over the last couple months, the military buildup here in Puerto Rico has been pretty noticeable. The United States used to have several military bases here. They had a big Navy base on the East Coast. They had a big Air Force base on the West Coast. There currently is a big National Guard facility down on the southern coast. For the last month or so, they've been running training programs, beach landings and assaults, practice runs on the southern coast here. And over that time period, the U.S. has started taking out boats coming from South America into the Caribbean, delivering drugs, which end up in the United States. And Trump and the U.S. military and Hegseth have taken some of those out. And I think we discussed it on the show, but it's just not going to stop there. They're going to go. They're not going to stop with boats in the Caribbean. They're going to go into the countries, and whether it's a full scale, military operation, whether it's black ops, whether it's some kind of a partnership with the local governments, I don't know, but I can tell you this is not ratcheting down. This is ratcheting up. And I think it's important to keep that in mind when you think about Argentina. The United States is very much trying to get more control of the Western Hemisphere, Central and South America. They're trying to get China out of there. And to do that, you need to have the southern part on your side. And I think that is a big part of what Argentina represents. Now, before we switch, and I'm gonna go over that in a little bit more detail, I want to remind everybody that Monetary Metals is a company that I recently became officially involved with, and I think everybody should consider Monetary Metals. Gold is at an all-time high. Gold had a bit of a crazy week, hit an all-time high, pulled back really hard, and then had another little rally into the end of the month or into the end of the week. Silver hit $50, and I think gold is at what, 4,000. It closed a little bit above 4,000. But everybody knows, who's listening to me, knows that I'm a huge believer in gold, and I think gold should be a cornerstone of your portfolio. But I don't think all of your portfolio should be in gold, and I don't think all of your portfolio should only be diversified out of gold into the miners. I think you should have a healthy allocation to gold. But within gold, you can have the really safe bullion on one end of that allocation, and you can have the miners on the other end of that allocation. but there's typically not a whole lot of options in the middle. And I think that's where Monetary Metals sits. And that's why I'm kind of excited to be working with them. It's a way to put gold to work as money in the real world. People tell me gold is money all the time. Well, this is a way to actually put it to work as money. And it's a way for a portion of your gold to be sitting in gold bullion, but also earning a yield on it. And, if you look at the math of putting gold plus a yield in an overall portfolio, it makes the overall portfolio more efficient, higher return, and less risk. So, I opened an account with them. I plan to keep adding money to it every month. And, it just kind of sits there and grows over time. So anyway, I encourage you guys all to check it out. You can go to monetary-metals.com/Santiago, and you'll see a lot more information there. Now, let me go back here. Let me do. I'm going to remove this for a second, and I'm going to bring this up. So, I think you guys can see my cursor here. Give me 1 second. Let me make sure I'm doing this right. I want to make sure you can see my. Yeah, okay. So let me just get off of there. Okay, so I think this is really important to understand again when we talk about Argentina, because I don't think you can just look through it as an economic lens. It is a geopolitical lens that it must be looked through. Again, as I mentioned earlier, I don't think Scott Bessent is out there buying Argentinian pesos because he thinks this is a great financial idea, but it could be a great idea from a geopolitical perspective. And as you know, that's the lens through which we look at just about everything now. But essentially, when you look at this, this is the world map, and for much of the last 30 or 40 years, it was like one big happy family. Of course, there was conflicts here and there, but for the most part, the world was becoming closer. It was becoming more globalized, and it was moving towards one supply chain. And it started moving away from that probably 10 years ago when Russia first, went into Ukraine. And then, it kind of picked up speed during COVID when, countries realized the strategic need to have their own supply chains. And so since that time, there's kind of been a rift, right? And, you can say that China and Russia and some of the global South have partnered, and then, Europe and, North America and, arguably Japan and Australia, the West, quote unquote, West on another side. And here's the thing is, I think that is largely true. I think the world is going through a divorce, and I think it's kind of mutual. I don't think it's just the United States that's trying to break away from China. I think China's trying to break away from the United States as well. I think each side is trying to pull back to their respective spheres. Now, that doesn't mean that the United States is surrendering global hegemony, and it doesn't mean they're not going to be involved when they think they need to be involved. But I do agree that each side is going to try to kind of, quote unquote, dominate their region of influence. And so when you think about it from that perspective, and you start to focus in on, the Western Hemisphere, and you take a closer look at it, the United States goal, and I kind of jokingly call this the United States of the Americas, because listen, whatever you think of Trump, I think whether you think he is, the reincarnation of Jesus or the Antichrist himself, I think, or at least I hope we can all agree he does have a fairly large ego, right? And, I think, and at the end of the day, he's a real estate guy. So I don't think he wants anything more than to be considered the greatest president in history and to get his face on Mount Rushmore, right? And so how do you do that? Well, you can't let China usurp the United States under your watch if you're going to be considered the greatest American president of all time. And, if you want to be considered a great president and this great real estate guy, why not go grab some more real estate? Now, again, I'm not saying this is the way things should be, but let's look at it from his perspective. And when you look at it from his perspective, it starts to make a lot more sense. I think he wants to control all of South America. I think he wants to control Greenland. I think he wants to control this whole entire Western Hemisphere. And the other thing I'll say is I don't think this is just about Trump. I think every president has kind of wanted this. I think Trump perhaps has the balls to actually go out and try to do it, and or the insanity to try to go out, and maybe that's the right way to say it. But I don't think this is a stretch to say that this is what is happening. And again, the Monroe Doctrine goes back 100 years. This isn't something that Trump just invented. I think he's just actually enforcing it. And when you look at Argentina down here at the bottom, and you realize that in the middle here, in Central and Northern South America, this is a big part of where the drugs come into the United States. And again, especially the fentanyl. The fentanyl gets shipped from China into Mexico. It gets manufactured in Mexico and some of these other places in South America, and then it gets sent into the United States. It also gets sent into Canada, and it comes down there. But, Trump hates drugs. The guy's never had a drink in his life. His brother was his hero and died of, I think, overdose of alcohol or alcoholism. The guy hates drugs. So I actually do believe he wants to stop the drugs coming in. But it's not just about stopping the drugs coming in to save Americans. If you stop the drugs coming in, you actually weaken the cartels and you weaken China. China and the cartels make ungodly amounts of money by shipping poison into the United States. And so that's what he's trying to stop. But it also plays, so it's not just a health thing. It's not just an America first thing. It's also a regional power thing. And so let's kind of zoom in here, because I think it's important to kind of understand this from a more geographical point of view. So this is this is where I live right here. This is Puerto Rico. A lot of drugs come from South America up into Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has been strategically important for hundreds of years because it sits right on the edge of the Caribbean and the Atlantic. It's where all the ships coming in from Europe to to the Caribbean, to Mexico, to northern South America, all come through. This is called the Mona Gap right here. And this was a huge thing even 300 or 400 years ago when in the days of the pirates. This was a strategic point. So Puerto Rico sits here, but the reason, and a lot of drugs will get shipped to Puerto Rico and then they go from there into the U.S. The reason Puerto Rico is an important part strategically, not just from a geographical perspective, but from getting drugs into the United States, is because Puerto Rico is a United States territory. If you can get the drugs into Puerto Rico, you have greatly reduced the risk of getting into the United States because you don't have to go through customs. You don't, if you fly from Puerto Rico to the United States, you don't have to go through customs. If you ship stuff from Puerto Rico into the United States, the customs aren't as strict as they would be if they were coming in from somewhere else. You can use the U.S. postal system. So that is part of the reason why Puerto Rico is a strategically important reason, and why drugs typically go through Puerto Rico. But part of the reason that the military is building up there is because, again, it controls access to the Caribbean, and then it gets you quick access to the northern parts of Venezuela now, or northern parts of South America. Now, what I think is interesting is when Trump first came to power, one of the first places that Marco Rubio went was El Salvador. And then one of the first places that Trump sent other people was to Venezuela. And then he sent, I think it was Kristi Noem, to Colombia. And I don't think it's an accident that he sent people there at the very beginning. And now, 6 months later, 7 months later, we have military buildup, the biggest military buildup in the Caribbean since the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, they're being serious about this. And I'm telling you, they're not just going to stop at taking out the boats. They're probably going to go into Venezuela because Venezuela also has oil. They're probably going to go into Colombia. They're probably going to go into all of these countries, including Mexico. And I'm not just talking about boats on the water. I'm talking about inland. And they've kind of said this as much. They haven't quite come out and said it. And I don't think we're invading these countries, but I think the U.S. military, again, whether it's Black Ops, whether it's Delta Force, whether it's some kind of a private partnership with mercenary people, I don't know, but I don't think this is an accident that this is happening, and I don't think it's just about oil in Venezuela. The other thing, I think, the other place that they went immediately was El Salvador. The reason that's important is because it sits right in the corridor between South America and North America. And a lot of the drugs go through Central America, Mexico, up into the United States. Not only that, but Bukele has a history of dealing with the the criminal gangs and the narcos. And so I think the United States is already kind of partnering with him, and I just think this is going to be a much bigger deal than people realize. And I think there's no doubt going to be unintended consequences. And there is no doubt going to be blowback. And there is no doubt going to be international uproar when, the United States takes on the cartels in the sovereign countries, sovereign geographical space of other countries. I think it's going to happen anyway. I don't necessarily like this. I don't necessarily think it's all going to go perfectly, but I think this is going to happen. And I think when you understand that, I think making sure you have, Argentina as an ally makes a lot more sense. If you're going to be doing a lot of stuff in the middle here, the last thing you want is having people come at you from either side. So I think that's a big part of what's going on. The other thing I wanted to tell you is, you know what? No, we'll leave that there for now. But one thing I do want to go over some charts. So let's go over let's go over some charts. This was obvious. The end of the week ended pretty crazy. So let's talk about that. Hold on a second. Got to pull up another screen here. Okay, going to look at some charts here. So this first chart is the VIX. We've talked about many times that I was expecting a correction in Q3, and we've been over the reasons why I was expecting that, and it just didn't come. In this business, which is the money management business, you don't get to make excuses when you get the timing wrong. You don't get to say, oh, I was right, but it just came 3 weeks late, or it came 2 weeks late. If you don't get the timing right, you're wrong. So this is not me saying, oh, look, I was right, I'm just late. Nope. If you don't get the timing right, you're wrong. But it is important to point out that some of the stuff that we thought was going to happen last month started to happen on Friday. Now, whether that continues or not, we're going to see. But Friday was a very big deal, because in the same way that all of this stuff is about China, in South America, China hit the front pages again on Friday because China said they were no longer going, or they were going to put export controls on critical minerals. And then Trump came back and said, well, then we're going to, put 100% tariffs starting on November 1st. And markets obviously didn't like that. The VIX spiked pretty severely on Friday. Markets sold off dramatically. So the VIX went from 16.5 to 21. The Dow had a huge sell-off. Let me just kind of zoom in here. The Dow, I think was down 1 or 2%. If you zoom out, it came all the way back down to its 50-day moving average. Same with the S&P 500, kind of pulled all the way back down to its 50-day moving average. The NASDAQ, not quite that far down, but I think it was down 3.5% on the day. Part of the reason these are selling off so hard is the markets had very much come to expect that all of this was behind us. But as we said many times, this is not behind us. This is only going to ratchet up. This is not going away. The competition, whatever you want to call it, between the United States and China is not going away. This is real, and it's going to last for a long time. And the idea that markets are only going to go up to the right and there's going to be no volatility is just silly. And this started to play out in a big way on Friday. But it wasn't just, but the other thing that I would say is part of the reason the drawdown comes so fast is that with the rise of passive management, and we've talked about this so many times, like when it goes up, it reinforces it to the upside. But once things start to go down and these passive strategies start to sell, there's no thinking involved. It's just a sell. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens on Monday morning when things open. But it wasn't just equities. Bitcoin had a huge sell-off. The crypto industry saw one of the biggest liquidations in history. Billions of dollars were lost. This is one of the reasons I do not think that Bitcoin is a flight to safety. I think Bitcoin is a pure play on global liquidity. And I think when global liquidity disappears, then Bitcoin tends to fall, and I think we saw that a big way yesterday. One of the things that's a little bit different, or that could make this a little different than it was in the spring, is that credit is starting to break down a little bit. Bond spreads tightened quite a bit. High yield sold off quite a bit this last week. If we look at options adjusted spread, which is basically a funding indicator, you can see it kind of spiked here. That's a pretty big move, in just a couple days. Pretty big move on there. If you look at some of the credit default swaps, they kind of spiked here as well. And so let me just kind of zoom in there. You can see it a little bit better. Yeah, you can see it's just an indication that credit is starting to tighten up, and that things are not quite as rosy under the surface as the overall markets might indicate. And then, of course, this is just the dollar going back to 2022. It's kind of gone sideways and then down pretty hard this year. It's kind of recently broke out of its downtrend, but it's basically still the same place it was back in April. So it's kind of gone sideways for the last 6 months. If this starts to go higher with the way everybody's positioned, and with risk on, other than the last 6 hours on Friday, with risk on still the norm, a breakout higher in the dollar could cause even more volatility. So that's what we're going to be looking for next week, to see whether volatility is just a 1 or 2 day thing, or whether this actually sticks around for a while. So anyway, that's it for this week. Thank you guys for tuning in, and we'll be back next week for another episode of Milkshakes, Markets, and Madness. Bye, guys.